So today we have Toby Mildon, and here is why he is awesome. He's a diversity and inclusion architect. He is the founder and director of Mildon, a boutique diversity and inclusion consultancy that helps HR leaders implement effective change strategies. Oh, he's got a book. It's called My Inclusive Growth, Future-Proof Your Business by Creating a Diverse Workplace, which provides real practical frameworks to deliver a sustainable DEI workplace. Can't stress how important that is. And his career has spanned everything from this and that, mostly diversity, mostly inclusion. He was also an in-house manager at Deloitte and at the BBC, where he also was the chairperson for their Disability Employee Resource Group. For you acronym nerds, that's ERGs. Hello, Toby.
Hey Russ, thanks ever so much for inviting me along.
Oh, thrilled to have you here. DEI. We're going to talk about the fears of DEI, and I'm really hoping we open a few minds to this, because DEI is certainly, the reputation of DEI has changed even just in the last 5 years. It's gone from everybody should do it to, oh my God, it's going to ruin everything. So I'm super curious to hear your perspective. But before we do, I have to ask you the question I ask everybody, Toby, which is, what is your best or worst employee experience?
Let's go for the best, and I'd like to share with you one of my first employee experiences. So it's going back quite a way now, but when I was a teenager and I was trying to get into the workplace, a lot of my friends were getting jobs working in supermarkets, stacking shelves, and I, being a wheelchair user, and I've got a muscle wasting condition, I knew that I wouldn't be able to do a physical job like that. I needed to do a desk-based job. And I was applying and approaching different companies and trying to get work experience. And I was receiving some knockbacks and rejections. But I had a really great experience with a bank manager. So I I made an appointment with a bank manager to open up a savings account. And but I had an ulterior motive, which was to try and get a job with the bank. And then at the end of the appointment, when I signed all the paperwork, the bank manager asked me whether there was anything else I wanted help with. And I said, well, yeah, I mean, actually, now that you come to mention it, I'd quite like a job, please. And to my surprise, he offered me some work experience. And this is a big, well-known bank in the UK. It's like one of the big major high street banks that we have. And it was the first time I think that I had come across what we would call an inclusive manager nowadays. He could see that I had a physical disability, that I was a wheelchair user, but he could also see my potential. And the bank that, or the branch that he worked in, was quite a small branch in a rural part of the West Country, not particularly accessible. But he spoke to his colleague in a bigger branch in a bigger town that was more accessible, and I got me work experience. And I ended up working for the bank on and off during my school, college, and university holidays for about 4 years. And getting experience with this bank was then a stepping stone for me to get some really fantastic experience working with other companies like British Airways, Accenture, the BBC, and Deloitte.
So it's funny, when I ask this question, I won't lie, 90% of the time it's something that happened to somebody 20 to 30 years ago, which is interesting because it really cements how important those early jobs are, those first jobs, those second jobs, in molding us for the rest of our career. They set the bar high or low
Mm.
in whatever that's going to be for the rest. I really love asking that question to start, but I always seem to end up asking the second follow-up question, which is, what did you carry with you from that? Because I'll be honest, not everybody is an inclusive leader like that. It stood out so much to you, but then you learned from that. You saw that, and I'm sure you noticed that that wasn't the norm sometimes. So what from your own career did you sort of carry with you through that?
Well, I think there's I suppose I learned the characteristics of being an inclusive leader or an inclusive manager and what that looks like. And that's a lot of the kind of the training and the coaching that I do with leaders nowadays. But I think it just goes to show, because I'm talking about this story, what, 20 years or so later, actually more than 20 years. And Yeah, I'm showing my age now, but I'm
You're
talking about
25. You look amazing. Keep going.
thanks. Um, I mean, yeah, some people say I've definitely got a face for podcasts, but I'm talking about this experience, what, like 25 or so years later, and it just goes to show how powerful positive and negative employee experiences have on rec- recommending a brand. So I didn't even mention the organization in this, and this is Lloyd's Bank, if anyone is interested. But I'm talking about this as a positive experience. And if somebody came to me today and said, I'm thinking of getting a job with Lloyd's Bank," I would talk favorably about that based on my prior experience. Similarly, I'm sure there are people out there who've had really bad experiences and they would not recommend a particular place to work. And in retail, they have this net promoter score. So if ever you go online and you buy a product online or you use a service, and the next day they email you and say, "Oh, on a scale of 1 to 10, how much would you recommend this particular product or service to your friends or family?" And then you go, "Oh, it was really crap. I'll give it a 1." They're calculating the net promoter score. And employers can do the same by creating the employee net promoter score.
Mhm.
And when I do surveys with clients, we have that in our survey. We say, how likely would you recommend this employer as an inclusive place to work, a place where you feel like you belong and you can really thrive, regardless of your background? And it's really interesting how people will or won't recommend their employers to other people. And it sticks for a very long time. It hangs around for a very long time if somebody has had a negative experience.
It's so emotional.
It
And
is.
it's something, and I've mentioned this on the show as well. These aren't bad days people are having. If they're talking about this 20, 30 years later, it's trauma. It is something that they're carrying with them far longer than anybody should. But those leaders that are having, maybe they had a bad day and they're taking it out on their employee, have no concept of the ripple effect of what they've done. It's much more impactful than anybody really realizes.
Absolutely.
I have to get into some baseline work with you first, Toby, because DEI is thrown around like crazy to the point where people will say DEI and don't even know it's an acronym. They'll just think that it's, oh, right, it's that thing that we have a program for that we just fired people around. Like it is this thing that certainly, and I want to talk about with the influence of the pandemic in a bit, but what in your definition is DEI?
Yeah, very good question, because the acronym is thrown around and it's not always D, E, and I. Honestly, you can get it in any format. Sometimes it's E, D, and I. Sometimes it's the D before the I, and other times it's the I before the D. Other people throw in a B for belonging or a J for justice. The E could stand for equality or equity. It's honestly, it's a bit of a minefield. For me, in its simplistic sense, let's go back to basics. I think if you imagine a pyramid, at the bottom of the pyramid, you've got the E for equity, because we don't live in a fair society. We don't have equality. But in order to create equality, in order to create that level playing field, we need to make sure that we're providing equity. Now, what I mean by equity is seeing the individual for who they are, recognizing what challenges they may or may not have, and giving them the tailored resources or support that they need in order to create a level playing field. So I'll give you a practical example. If I was to come and work for your business and you gave me a standard issue laptop, I wouldn't be able to do my job. You're giving me the same equipment as every other new starter, but I still couldn't do my job because I can't use my arms and hands. But if you spent $300 or $400 on speech to text software, and the one that I use is called Dragon Naturally Speaking, if you put that software on my computer, I'm then able to do my job just as well as anybody else, because now I can write reports and emails using my voice. So that's an example of equity. It's about understanding what challenges I have, and then you're giving me the support that I need. Once you've done that, you want your people to feel like they're working in a fantastic, inclusive culture. This is the I. And this is where I'm working in a culture where I feel like I can bring as much of myself to work as I would like to. that I can be myself, that I'm able to do my best work, that I feel like I have a sense of belonging in the team, that I'm empowered to do my best work, that I'm able to progress in my career. And that's very much like a culture piece. Now, if organizations can conquer that, then the icing on the cake is, or at the top of the pyramid, is the D for diversity. They are in a much stronger position to be able to attract and recruit a diverse workforce and retain a diverse workforce. And we know through lots of research that's been done by the likes of McKinsey and lots of academic institutions that diversity or diverse teams outperform homogenous teams. They are better at problem solving, they're more innovative, they're more creative, they it's easier to attract and retain people into a diverse workforce. And but the thing is, you're not able to attract and retain a diverse workforce unless you've got that kind of culture of inclusion underpinning it.
So, as a communications nerd, I've noticed when you communicate your work, you don't say DEI. You say diversity and inclusion. You don't even see equity or equality in your language. Is there a reason for that?
Yeah, it's a bad habit, if I'm honest.
Ah.
But it might also be an example of how language has evolved even in recent years. Because when I started off working in the field of diversity and inclusion at the BBC, I started doing it kind of proper around about 2014. The terminology was D and I, D ampersand I, diversity and inclusion. Then we have started to see E being introduced more, E for equity or equality. It's used interchangeably quite a lot. But the thing is, it's for me, it's not the, the acronym honestly changes so much depending on so many different organizations, and they all have their different reasons for using different acronyms. So some organizations will intentionally put the I before the D because they're saying that the culture of inclusion is more important, or having a focus on culture of inclusion first will help them attract and retain the D, the diversity. Other organizations say, well, we really need the E in there because we need to make sure that we don't forget that we need to create equity in order to, before we start to think about having an inclusive culture. So honestly, there's always some rationale or explanation behind it.
I love your reason is like I just can't keep up. You're
It's
right because
always evolving.
fair, and I've seen it where it's almost like a math equation. If you do diversity and then you do equity and then you do inclusivity, then it equals belonging.
Yeah.
So I've even seen that a few times. So this all sounds like a no-brainer. This sounds like this is how work should happen. I've done conversations about accessibility on this show about how all the benefits behind really embracing any acronym in this realm. So why are organizations afraid of it to some degree, or how are they afraid of it?
So there's a number of challenges when we look at senior leadership teams who really should be driving this agenda from the top of the business because they set the tone for the organization. They are often afraid of saying the wrong thing, doing the wrong thing, causing offense or embarrassment to other people or themselves. But their reaction is to recoil and avoid having difficult, awkward conversations, avoid showing vulnerability as a senior leader, and therefore they tend to avoid the topic rather than leaning into their discomfort or their awkwardness or their vulnerability and having those brave conversations.
It's funny that basically leadership is afraid of this because they're not leaders. Is that really kind of what I'm hearing? Because if you're a great leader, adaptability and adoption and change management and humanity should be a huge part of yourself as a leader. And then you're literally saying that's the reason they don't.
I think it's not so much that. I think it's about maybe a lack of confidence around some. We call it inclusive leadership behaviors, but every time I do this inclusive leadership training or coaching or mentoring with leaders, I'm sitting there thinking to myself, this isn't this isn't necessarily about inclusive leadership. This is just good leadership.
Yeah.
So one for example, one of the key behaviors of quote unquote inclusive leadership is empathy. And this is something that all leaders should have. And empathy isn't about feeling like you do understand what somebody else's lived experience is like, but taking the time to create a space to understand where they're coming from. So it's a bit like active listening in a way. And let me give you a really practical example. So recently here in the UK, we've had some, you may have seen it in the news, we've had some civil unrest where there were racially motivated rioting happening in some of our urban areas. And at that time, senior leaders were faced with the challenge of people in their organization not feeling safe coming to work. So people were worried about their commute to work because they were worried that if they would take the train or the tram or the bus, that they would be racially abused physically or verbally. And people were afraid to go to work. They were afraid to send their kids to school. Now, as an inclusive leader, like if you're a white if you're a white leader who's never really been on the receiving end of racism, it's not about empathy. Is not about thinking, well, I know where you're coming from because I've been in your shoes. That's not empathy. Empathy is about taking the time to understand what somebody's experience is like, how they feel about that particular situation, and then just creating that space to be able to really understand. And then you can go in and provide the necessary support afterwards. And empathy is really important, and it's backed up in my own podcast. I did an interview with an author of a report from the Catalyst organization. You should get them on your podcast. Honestly, they're such a great organization. They do loads of great thought leadership. And the report was written around the time of George Floyd's murder in the States and the, I suppose, the pandemic as well. And they said that this perfect storm had happened where organizations were trying to figure out how to respond to these social incidents and the crisis. And they in their research, they basically said that empathy was the number one skill that leaders needed to have to deal with the situation. And then they said also authenticity was really key because if people didn't think that your anti-racism policy or your COVID response policy was authentic, they would sniff that a mile off. So the conclusion of their report was authenticity was critical and empathy was the number one skill that inclusive leaders had to have.
I'm curious what you think, especially with, I'm glad you mentioned George Floyd. I'm glad you mentioned the pandemic because there was this outcry during the pandemic. We're all sitting at home. We're like, why don't we treat people better? So there was this really push on organizations to get DEI right. They hired heads of DEI in these large organizations. Fast forward a couple of years, most of those divisions or leadership are gone. Never to mind the fact that most of those DEI leaders were people of were also diverse themselves. So they're saying it's an other person's job, which just blew my mind. But needless to say, what has changed so much over the last little while? And can we bring this back?
There's been lots of different outside pressures. There's been a lot of rhetoric amongst our politicians and our politics, both in the US and in the UK. There's also economic pressures as well. A lot of businesses are struggling at the moment. Cash flow isn't great. And unfortunately, diversity and inclusion is one of the first things to get dropped. And I think that in part it's around the mindset that we have about it. It's often seen as a kind of extracurricular cost center to the organization. It's not seen as a strategic imperative. And it's really interesting because at the time of the first lockdowns during COVID, um, I actually ran a series of webinars which asked the question of, if organizations continued to focus on diversity and inclusion during the pandemic, would they be able to bounce back harder and faster than those organizations that decided to not focus on diversity and inclusion? And I think the conclusion, when I was running my webinars and I was doing the various focus groups, were that organizations that continued to focus on diversity and inclusion during the pandemic would probably future-proof themselves
Mhm.
stronger, that they would have the ability to bounce back much more confidently after the pandemic.
They're almost shooting themselves in the foot by being reactionary. I mean, I can't tell you how many studies I've read where embracing DEI will actually help you with productivity, innovation, all the things we say we want.
Mm,
And then when it comes to tactics, we're basically having this cognitive dissonance where it's this, we know it's successful, but we're going to do this anyway.
yeah, yeah, absolutely.
So I want to get back to the fear piece a bit of the nervousness of saying the wrong thing or just approaching it wrong. How does a fear like that coming from our leaders, how does that impact the workplace, our relationships, the employee's perception of leadership?
Yeah, for me, it's it links into a bigger culture piece. I think senior leaders are afraid of saying or doing the wrong thing for a number of reasons. There's a cancel culture that they're worried about. They don't want to embarrass themselves. A lot of senior leaders have this kind of mindset that because of their seniority or their position, they need to be seen as having all of the answers or know what they're talking about. Again, that goes back to that lack of vulnerability of saying, you know what, I'm not an expert in everything. I don't know everything, but I'm here to learn. A lot of senior leaders, there's an ego that they have to live up to. It's just part of the human psyche, I think. But yeah, there's this fear of saying the wrong thing, doing the wrong thing, causing offence or embarrassment, getting quote unquote cancelled, not being seen to know it all, have all the answers. Again, that lack of vulnerability.
And I can just see all these employees thinking you don't take this seriously. You don't, because they may, leaders are often executive are so out of touch a lot of
Mm,
times. They're more figureheads. They're more the faces that show up on a Zoom call or that sort
yeah,
of thing. So from an employee perspective, they're like, well, if I don't look like you don't care about me.
yeah,
You are not prioritizing me. There's no success here for me if you don't do even the basics for me to be able to do my job. So I can see that huge cracks in the organization.
yeah. And this is what I hear a lot. People look up in their organization. Oftentimes, the lower ranks of an organization look more diverse or are more diverse than the most senior parts of the business, the board level. And I think that's just a consequence of historical lack of inclusion. And it's hopefully something that we're going to see shift over the next few decades, because this is something that's not going to change overnight. But what that means is that people often look up at the top of an organization when they join, and they can't see themselves reflected. And they might not consciously be thinking this, but it's often happening on this kind of other than conscious level, where they're looking up at the top of the business. They don't see themselves, they don't see somebody that is like them, and they're subconsciously telling themselves, I just don't have a future here. There's no pathway for me to get to the top of the business. So I'm going to start looking elsewhere, where I might see people that are more like me, because human beings are creatures of habit and familiarity. We like to be hanging out with people like ourselves. We have this similarity bias, and we will go and find our own kind.
It also highlights the ignorance of the top not realizing what they're communicating. I can't tell you how many websites I'll just go to their leadership tab on their corporate website and they show all these smiling pictures and I'm like, wow, white guy, white old guy, white. Oh, there's a female. Like it's,
Who will
but
often be the
still, there's
HR
a
director.
homogeny. So you've been in the space for a while. You've been trying to move the needle, for lack of a better phrase.
hmm
What is that aha moment? What is that thing that helps overcome this fear for organizations and their leadership?
Um, so the aha moment for a lot of organizations is really understanding their why. Um, Sorry to have to kind of steal words from Simon Sinek, where he talks about start with why. Um, it does start with why, and senior leaders need to get their head around the why. Um, One thing I quite often say is that lots of senior leaders will go out and they'll kind of get this on a very cognitive level. They'll read the McKinsey reports, or they'll read something from the Harvard Business Review that talks about how important ED&I is to business. But what they really struggle to translate that into their own world, into their own organization, into their own industry, and they really need to get to the core of their unique why, because it varies for different organizations. So I've worked in healthcare. For them, it links back to patient safety, about delivering health outcomes for patients. For a police force, it's about building stronger relationships with what they would call underserved members of the community, and therefore being able to report back to central government on effective crime busting strategies. For a retailer, it's about building strong consumer relationships with a diverse customer base and being able to sell more products to those consumers. So every organization will have its why, but you need to, like Simon says, he says that your why is not an invention, it's a process of discovery. You need to go on that discovery. It exists. You have to just go digging around for it and brush it off and grind it down, and a bit like finding a diamond. You've got to go through that process of discovery.
I love one of the tools you can use, which is the 5 whys, which is
Yeah,
not just saying why, but then just continuing on the process. Because how many organizations are like to make money? I'm like, oh, you're missing the point of this exercise.
yeah, yeah. I use the 5 whys exercise all the time. It's really simple. I and this is an example of how actually I've managed to take a lot of work from my project management days in IT. We would do the 5 whys analysis as a root cause analysis within IT. And then when I moved into diversity and inclusion, I was like, hang on a second, we could use the same tool for diversity and inclusion, and it works.
Love that. I love that. So, what about the leaders that are like, okay, what's the ROI, Toby?
hmm
Where's the numbers? Show me the numbers. Why
Yeah.
should I invest all this money? Why can't I? We're hiring fine, even though, as you point out, there's this missing rung in the corporate ladder
Mm.
for those that want to move up. So, is there a measurable way to really hammer this home for some leaders?
Oh, yes, there is. And I love it. I love the ROI. And I wish I could have more conversations like this with chief financial officers, because I normally talk to a head of HR. I would love to be talking to more chief financial officers and chief operating officers, because it goes back to the real core business case here. But to your point around what is the ROI, I'll give you a simple example. So I do a lot of surveys with clients, and my favorite question on this survey that employees have to fill out is, are you seriously considering leaving the business in the next 6 months because you don't feel that you're respected or that you belong? And then employees can say yes, no, yes, but for other reasons, or prefer not to say. And then what we do is we correlate that with the salary data that we collect at the same time. And I'll just give you an example, because we run this through an algorithm. I've been working with a technology company. They employ just shy of 1,000 people. And of the employees said that they were seriously thinking of leaving because they didn't feel respected or that they belong. We calculated that it would potentially cost the business £1.5 million. So we then sat down with the CFO and we said, look, this is potentially costing your business £1.5 million. So if you were to run a program to try and improve the culture, to try and reduce the number of people that were seriously thinking of leaving the business, let's say you put £30,000 into that project, that potentially represents a really good return on investment. And that's one way of being able to position it.
Yeah, if you can't put it in a spreadsheet sometimes, Toby, people don't, or a Gantt chart, or like you
Yeah,
can't put it in something that people can touch, whether it's on a screen or in front on a piece of paper. It's almost like it's not important enough
yeah,
for them to invest in.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, that's one metric. I mean, there are loads of others that organizations want to pick. I mean, you might want to think about the cost of reputational damage. Look at years ago, look at the sexual harassment claims that were made against Uber and how much that cost them in dollars, and also the reputational damage as well. That's another way of being able to look at it. If an employee successfully claims unfair dismissal on grounds of discrimination and you end up in an employment tribunal, that is a very costly place to go.
You mentioned earlier about the fear of making a mistake, which could be blown up into just failing at implementing DEI initiatives or just into the DNA of your organization.
Mm.
So I don't know if organizations understand that generationally, Gen Z, Canadian, Gen Z, Gen Z, will go on Glassdoor and social media if they see things that are not embracing of accessibility, diversity, and so forth.
Mm.
So does that reinforce the fear that it could blow up as a PR problem?
Yeah,
But then, if they do it, it's great. If they don't do it, it can become this huge thing, and yet they still don't do a thing.
yeah, yeah. I mean, there's some really interesting research coming out about Gen Z or Gen Z, depending on where you are in the world. Um, the general consensus is that it's a bit of a generalization, but the general consensus is that Gen Zs are really interested in organizations that are doing good things, have got social impact, that take diversity and inclusion seriously, doing good things for the environment, and they're choosing to work for organizations that are in alignment with their personal values. And it is a buyer's market out there, as in these candidates are actively choosing who to go and work for or leaving an organization because they don't have that values alignment. And I think, unfortunately, those organizations that don't recognize that are the ones that are going to miss out on this new talent that is coming through in our markets, because they are our future talent, they are our future leaders, and organizations need to act now to be able to attract and recruit and retain these people.
And I was just noting this as I was catching up on a few bits of research that in the Edelman Trust Barometer, I think it was in 2023, they talked about Gen Z, but not only of like as exactly like you're saying, is this is the next workforce we need to pay attention to, but also their influence on other generations like millennials and Gen X. 93%, I think, are listening to Gen Z about work-life balance,
Mm,
about diversity, equity, inclusivity. And they're saying, yeah, why isn't it like this?
yeah,
They're questioning the status quo based on the conversations they're having with those younger generations. And I don't think organizations get that enough.
absolutely. And also, organizations, when they're talking about being inclusive of different age brackets or generations, there's a lot of focus on the Gen Zers, but we've now got what, 4 to 6 generations working within the same organization. And inclusion is about actually being inclusive of all of those different generations, and they all have different expectations and requirements. So baby boomers who are still working in businesses have got their own set of expectations. They've got their own experiences that we need to still respect and value, and their skills and experience will complement the perspectives and skills and experience of the Generation Z coming through into the workplace. So we need to be inclusive across the board. And then we've also got intersectionality happening as well, where we've got people who have multiple characteristics and identities. So with an aging workforce, we see an increase in disability. The vast majority of people will acquire their disability during working age adult life. And organizations are needing to make sure that they are inclusive of people who have got different types of disabilities or impairments within the business.
I'm really glad that you made it a little more clear that diversity isn't just one thing.
No, it's not.
Because but you'll get that where you'll see, well, we're a diverse workforce, and all that leadership is seeing is color of skin,
Yeah.
right? They're pigeonholing what diversity could be when it is a kaleidoscope of different, basically, people that aren't you. I'm sorry, but it's
Yeah.
that person at the top. But they'll see it as a checkbox exercise, going, but Toby, we are very diverse, when their identity, what their definition is not the same as perhaps of those of their employees.
Yeah, and an example that I use in my trainings is that diversity is a bit like an iceberg where you see 10% of the iceberg poking above the waterline. And these could be our visible characteristics, and some of the characteristics may be covered under equality legislation. But then there's 90% of the iceberg below the waterline, which is harder to see or invisible. And these can be some of our classical traits. So somebody's sexuality, for example, may not be visibly obvious to you, but and therefore hidden beneath the waterline, or they might have an invisible or non-apparent disability. But it could be other things like whether you're introverted or extroverted, whether you grew up in the countryside or in the middle of a big metropolitan city. All of these different experiences contribute to our unique perspective on life and our differences and our diversity.
We've been talking a lot about the top of an organization, their senior leaders, but leadership is everywhere. So I'm
Hmm.
kind of curious as to your thoughts of, and I hate the term best practices, maybe better practices or practices that might work, things that organizations within leadership, maybe it's middle management, maybe it's emerging leaders, junior executives, what is something they could be doing to help foster this culture? Maybe the top of the organization is failing at this, so they want to take their best step forward throughout the organization themselves. Like, and I'm thinking of ERGs because you were a president of one. Is there anything else they can do?
Yeah, one of the I think one of the most challenging levels of an organization is middle management. I call it the sandwich effect, because quite often as a middle manager you're feeling pressure from the top, where a senior leadership team is saying diversity and inclusion is so important to our organization. Here's our lovely strategy that we've developed. Now, middle managers, you have to go and implement it. And then you've got all the pressure coming up from the bottom of your organization. You've got team members who are putting in requests and demanding change at the grassroots level. And as a manager at that middle level, you're being squeezed at both ends, and it's a very, very difficult position to be in. Your question's quite broad, and I think maybe a place for a manager to begin, if they are interested in how they just become a better manager, is to perhaps just go and research the skills of an inclusive leader, or what I just call just a good manager. To be honest with you, we've already talked about one, which is empathy. We work with a team of occupational psychologists who've developed 6 behaviors. Empathy is one of them, and it was based on a project that they did with the Metropolitan Police in London. they were asked by the Met Police to help the organization become an anti-racist organization. And the psychologists basically concluded that your relationship with your manager is so critical that it comes down to how well your manager behaves. And they developed 6 behaviors, and empathy is top of the list, and it's backed up by that research that of catalysts that I mentioned earlier. The other behaviors are having a learning orientation or an open mindset, being flexible in how you work with other people or having a different approach, and composure as well. Being able to kind of be aware of your emotions, not let your emotions get the better of you, i.e., fly off the handle every time you're stressed or frustrated. And these are behaviors that we're able to measure on a scale of 1 to 10. And then having a coaching conversation with yourself. You don't even need to do the assessment. You could sort of say, you could just sit down with yourself and go, okay, when the pressure's on, when I'm feeling stressed and under pressure, like how composed am I on a scale of 1 to 10? Or how empathic am I when a colleague comes to me and shares a personal challenge or difficulty that they're having in their personal life or at work, and say, okay, on a scale of 1 to 10, okay, and then draw like a little X on the line, and then ask yourself a coaching question. Well, if I was just to increase that by 1 point, what might that look like? What are the skills or behaviors that I would need to demonstrate just to increase it a notch? And that's one thing that a manager could do.
I've often said that self-awareness is probably one of the greatest superpowers any leader can ever have,
Mm-hmm.
because it will start you down a path of understanding how you react to, like you said, anger and frustration as much as joy or anything else. So I thrilled you highlighted that. Are you hopeful, Toby? I mean, you've been in this role as someone that's been championing DEI. You've seen the push of embracing DEI, and then you've seen the other side of it where it's sort of been pulled back for many reasons. Are you still hopeful for the path ahead for organizations?
I am. I am. I talk to a whole mix of organizations, and I talk to a spectrum of organizations that have got very little time for ED&I. They just don't see it as an important part of their business strategy. I also talk to loads of organizations that see it as a critical component of their culture and the future success of their business. And guess which organizations I end up working with? I do end up working with those organizations that I would say are more forward thinking and advanced, but then I'm going to be biased when I say that. So I am hopeful, and I think what I would like to see happen over the next decades is that, in a way, organizations do make their ED&I people redundant, not because they are trying to cut costs, but they've finally realized that it's just good business. It just has to be embedded into the DNA of the organization, into their infrastructure, into their systems and processes, their human-centered design when they're building their products and services and employee user journeys and things like that. And they're like, you know what, we don't actually need a separate ED&I department to be doing this. We have upskilled and equipped, and everybody in the business has got the capabilities to do this themselves. And I always draw parallels to health and safety. It's like everyone in an organization knows what they need to do around health and safety. They know how to keep people safe physically. They know often how to respond if there's an incident that happens. Often you have a health and safety manager there who's just there to make sure that the governance is in place and the policies and the processes are there. But at the end of the day, health and safety is everybody's responsibility. And I would like to see ED&I get to the same place.
I think that might actually even be a roadblock, and I'm sure you would say the same, is putting it as a separate department is you're literally treating it like an other. Like it's
Mm.
somebody else's responsibility. Oh, that person that's in that division in the other state or province is responsible for all our DEI. Oh, it's not in the hiring practice. Oh, it's that person's fault.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think it's literally part of the problem.
Mm.
So I love the idea of making it less detached and more part of the DNA.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you for this, Toby. Really appreciate your time
You're
and your
welcome.
insights and your experience and knowledge in this. I'm sure it's a conversation I will continue to have on this show, and I'm sure it's on yours as well. It's just too important not to. So we're going to wrap it up, Toby, with the last question I always ask, which is for you. What is one simple action that you suggest people can do right now to improve their relationships at work?
One thing I've been practicing lately, because I wouldn't say I'm a brilliant manager, is radical candor. And by the book, I think it's Kim Scott that wrote the book Radical Candor.
Yeah.
And what I've learned from her work and her model is she kind of presents this 2x2 grid. But radical candor is about being direct with people, but also caring at the same time. I often fall into the trap of what she would call ruinous empathy, which is where you are not direct with people because you're trying to avoid hurting their feelings. It's almost like a kind of over empathy, and therefore you're not being direct with people and you're caring because you care too much in a way. And I'm trying to practice more with my team this, what she calls radical candor, which is about being more direct with people, setting clear expectations, expressing your concerns, fears, and giving direct feedback whilst also caring for the individual, which is what she calls radical candor. So, sorry, I'm waffling, but the short answer would be to try and practice that. And if you are in any doubt about what that entails, then just read her book, which is very good anyway. And
That
I
is
don't get any
Toby.
commission, by the way, from her.
No money changed hands. No, not at all.
No, it's just a really good book.
That is Toby Mildon. He's a diversity and inclusion architect, founder and director of his own consultancy called Mildon. And speaking of good books you should probably pick up, he's written one called My Inclusive Growth, Future-Proof Your Business by Creating a Diverse Workforce. Thank you so much, Mildon.
You're welcome. Thank you.